How's it going, everyone? This is International Master Daniel Wrench. This is chess.com, and this is the next video lecture in the series Pawn Structure 101. Today we're discussing the Scheveningen pawn structure once again. As we discussed in the last video, we will be moving on to other ways for White to approach this structure. In particular, White's slow play movement with f3 rather than f4. And we're going to kind of discuss a few more of the ins and outs regarding the structure and talk about when the f3 structure is most effective, sort of a foreshadowing of a future structure that we're going to cover. Switching to a new genre, I wouldn't say genre, I guess, a new way for White to play. We look for a stem game for Black. I was searching in terms of what a good stem game was to execute the ideas that I wanted to teach, and of course we come across a game by the one and only Garry Kasparov. Once again, using the Najdorf to play against 1e4, which was his favorite weapon for a very long time, and maybe the majority of his career as a way to play dynamically against e4, so he once again uses it. And here we see the Sousa once again. The last video, of course, we saw bishop to e2, the more, I guess, slightly less active in terms of a pure classical sense, a slightly less active development of the bishop, but we talked about the purpose of it coming behind the f-pawn here, and if you want to review the last video, you can. We talked about all the ins and outs, the pluses and minuses, and the way White needs to balance that position as far as looking for g4 and Black's idea of getting pressure on the e4 pawn, etc. So you can back up and review that if you want. But here we're back to the Sousa, and after e6, the natural and most theoretically accurate move, bishop b3, was played, and here Kasparov played bishop e7. These days, it's considered much more accurate for Black to play b5 immediately, to immediately exert pressure on the center, not because he necessarily intends to play b4 and kick the knight and take this pawn right away anyway, because there's all kinds of potential issues with that, namely that even when you go for these lines, if you just simply play all out to go after this pawn, there's aggressive ideas here for White as far as tactics go, but even a very simple and aggressive move like f4 has been explored by White and been really effective because Black has wasted so much time and is still lacking a lot in terms of development. So that's not really the main reason we play b5, but more so in the Najdorf, it's about establishing the threat, not necessarily the execution, and Black uses the b7 square, of course, to complete his development. So b5 is the most theoretically accurate way to go. Kasparov played bishop e7. This is an older game of his, not most theoretically accurate move, and mainly that's because after the move castles, here we would be transposing pretty much, but the main point of why I would say that this move order is slightly less accurate is actually because of the slightly more aggressive either f4 and even queen f3. Queen f3 not being a very popular move, but it's an interesting one. After queen f3, if Black simply castles, queen to g3 right away with threats over here can be really effective. We're not going to go into this line here because there's really not much information to pull from. It's a lot of self-at-home analysis by me and some others. But I would say that bishop e7 is slow and not the most effective. One, because of ideas like that. And two, because if White simply sticks his head down and plays f4 more aggressively, even these positions after f4, castles, f5 right away, e5, knight d to e2, knight b to d7, White can play the move knight to g3 and attempt to eliminate this knight over here and sort of play really aggressively on the light squares for the rest of the game, the remainder of the game. So again, those positions are not 100% clear and 100% accurate, but I would say that Black's immediate pressure with the move b5 as well as the preparation to complete the queenside development is one of the things that's important in the Najdorf. And so just a little theoretical advice, even though Kasparov played bishop e7 here, it's not considered the most accurate move and statistically not played nearly as often or scoring as well for Black. But in this game, after White chose to go ahead and just get castled instead, and Black played the move b5, as I was saying, and then sort of tongue-tied and backed up, this position is a direct transposition to the move order we might have seen if Black had played b5 immediately and White had just castled, Black then playing bishop to e7. So it's possible we would reach this position anyway. I just wanted to point out the nuances of that move order. And here's where White chose to play sort of a slow move here not really the ideal way for white to approach this position, and it sort of leads us to seeing the, a very good stem game for how black would play against a slow play. So again, we've highlighted that f4 and f5 is a natural way to play here. We've talked about the Sozin ideas with the queen coming out to f3, and we've had a few different videos on this structure, but here white plays the slow move a3. And this move makes sense, especially, and it's executed by a lot of amateur players who may not know a lot of theory, because it just seems like such a natural reaction. Your opponent's extended b5. Well, clearly this is likely a threat, and so I'm going to go ahead and stop it. But it's really not. It's not an immediate threat for black because of reasons we've highlighted. That if black really wants to go after this pawn before castling, he's risking a lot to do so. So it's not an immediate threat, and white needs to play this Scheveningen structure with more aggressive intentions and create these threats of these moves we've talked about here. And so a3 is a move that is slow, and with the right approach by black, which of course Kasparov is going to take, we're going to see that this sort of passive approach allows black to really dictate a lot of the game. The play on the queen side pretty much dominates if white doesn't try to extend and create any pressure against the structure, and we're going to see sort of strategically how that plays out. For the record, the best approach for white instead of a3 is considered the move queen to f3 here. Not only are you threatening immediate ideas with e5, but this is sort of a modern way that they're playing a lot of Sozins. That first Sozin game I showed you where white was really aggressive with e5, if you remember, I think it was part 5. We talked about the drawbacks of that and kind of said that the ideas here have sort of, evolved a little bit, and white is applying this early queen f3 move in a lot of variations of the Sozin now, even variations where he hasn't castled and actually tries to castle long. That's not what we're talking about here, but some advanced players here will know the lines I'm talking about. And the idea is that the queen not only creates immediate tactics, but the queen does well on g3, putting pressure on the king's side, exerting pressure on the potentially weak d-pawn, and so it makes a lot of general philosophical sense for white in this structure. And here black has two ways to approach it. Both queen c7 and queen to b6 are totally possible. Noted should be that a common and natural move like bishop b7 that pins the e4 pawn and seems to take care of all the funny business is a very common mistake, and it walks into an immediately very strong and potentially lethal tactic if you're playing a strong player with the move bishop takes e6. After fe, knight e6, the queen finds a square. White wins a third pawn for the piece and continues to develop an attack. There are several moves here. Knight f5, knight h5, even just natural developing moves. Not quite right away because the knight, but both of these moves are possible, and white maintains a very strong initiative, and potentially I would say just like crushing attack, with strong players playing. So black doesn't make that mistake often. This sacrifice is not always deadly. A lot of times players will choose to try to do it even after black has castled, trying to take the two pieces for the rook after they fork the queen and rook, and we're actually going to have an example game of that in our final video here on the Scheveningen structure, at least from the classical sense that we're talking about. We're going to be talking about the Scheveningen structure when we move on to another structure, which is the English attack, and again that's going to be a little bit down the road. That's a structure from white's perspective, but the sacrifice on e6 to get the fork is not always that effective, so white players need to not be too overzealous with this idea. But when we talk about pawn structures, again, we want to talk about not just the strategical ideas, but the tactical patterns that occur within a particular structure. And so that's why I wanted to highlight this, just so that you're aware that this idea of taking on e6 with the bishop and then taking with the knight can be a very effective one and cause all kinds of problems. So that's why we see the moves queen c7 or queen to b6. Both of these moves are fine, by the way, because e5 now can be met by the move bishop b7 with tempo on the queen, and black might either win the pawn, or even after take here, and black has a really strong initiative and a totally good position, so not really what white wants to do. Queen to b6 is another modern way for black to play the position, gains a tempo on the knight, again preparing to meet e5 with bishop b7, and after bishop e3, black plays the move queen to b7, sort of fianchettoing the queen, if you will. Kind of funny, right? You fianchetto the queen, and black's idea here is that he's left the bishop protecting this critical e6 square, which is, sort of prophylactically a nice place for the piece, and the queen does just as good of a job as the bishop as far as exerting pressure here. Also, the queen sort of operates as a battering ram behind the stormer of these two pawns, and in a lot of variations where white has actually castled long with the same type of attacking idea, this maneuver of the queen is a very, very common one. And so we're not going to be going over all the sharp lines of those variations right now, because those aren't variations that fit inside the modern classical themes of this pawn structure that we're trying to teach you in this video. It's more like a theoretical discussion. I've covered some games like that. I think I showed some games in the game that I lost to Emery Tate, and some other games have seen ideas where white is castled long, and we've seen effective shots with like the knights hopping in here, different types of tactical patterns that exist there. So we haven't completely neglected those ideas, but those are not the main theme of the structure and the way we've been talking about white's approach against the Scheveningen structure and black's approach therein and all that stuff. So, but I just wanted to highlight that Queen F3 is probably the most effective way to handle this less effective move order by black. And again, black would want Queen C7 or Queen to B6. And again, possibly Queen F3 even before castles was actually the most effective way to take advantage of this move Bishop E7, leaving the option, of course, to castle long. So that's all I'm going to say about the moves that didn't actually happen in this game. I'm going to say that, again, an early F4, I will point out, is not as good as an early Queen F3, even after castles. And here's an example where you can play Bishop E7, as now this tactic, if you want to pause your clocks for a second to see why it doesn't work, you can. But basically, this tactical pattern existing in the Scheveningen structure just doesn't work here because black gets this check. And after the king moves, you have a couple different ideas. You can play the move King F7 even, and defend the defend the pawn and attack the knight and say, get out of my house. Or you can say, you know what, maybe I'll just go ahead and take your E4 pawn, and we'll go ahead and see who ends up getting the attack here. Big kitty cat, especially once I start getting the G file, right? That could be Ouchtown population white king. So there's different things for black to do there. That's just an example that I wanted to include to show an example where it doesn't really work to take. So again, we may talk about the patterns existing there in the final video of this structure, when we can finally, unchain ourselves of the structure and move on and go on with life, right? I'm sure we're all excited about that. So in the game, again, white played the move A3 instead of the more effective Queen F3. We just talked about why F4 isn't as good because, again, of Bishop B7 exerting immediate pressure, threatening this, and this tactic just doesn't work here. So black is happy here. And again, if white wanted to really take advantage of Bishop E7 instead of B5, you might needed to see F4 immediately before castles, or Queen F3, as I already talked about earlier in the video. So that's all the summary I'm going to give as far as the little ins and outs of the move orders here of the Najdorf-Sozen variation, the Scheveningen structure here. For those of you who always feel like I get off on a little bit of a tangent, that's not a part of the Scheveningen structure. It's partly my teaching style. I want you to feel like you understand how the position in the game is developing on both a theoretical and sort of a general sense, so that when we do get to sort of the critical moments, you don't feel like we got there by skipping over, possibly important things. A lot of players, even if you end up understanding a really detailed and complicated middle game of 25 moves of theory, how often is your opponent, screwing up theory before move 10, right? I mean, come on. So you need to understand the general ideas and the possible tactical patterns that exist within a structure in order to be a well-rounded player, and not just kind of overlook those. So that's just kind of my teaching style, and that's why we have a lot of videos covering things sometimes. But that's the deal. So in this game, now we're going to see how Kasparov played and really played well here. A3 is just a move that is just too slow. Again, it's defending against a threat that is sort of a phantom one, as I've sort of highlighted, and not taking the most aggressive roads to try to play this structure. So here he played castles, which is totally natural, and after Bishop E3, Bishop E7, F3 is played. As you can see from white's perspective, if white chooses to play a little bit more passively, then you're one developing move away by black to basically having to defend this E4 pawn, rather than whether it's push it dynamically or create other threats to defend it, right? What I'm saying is that it's like the theory of an isolated queen pawn, where generally the joke is the best IQP, isolated queen pawn, is an IQP with no defense. Because by definition, if you have an IQP that has no defense, that means that one, it's still on the board, and two, you've created so much counterplay that pawn is not really something that your opponent can focus on, because the counterplay is too strong, and that's really how you want to play an active IQP position. And so I would say there's something similar to be said for this here. Just like in that last example, I noticed in the structure where when black was getting pressure to the E4 pawn before white got the pawn storm going, if you remember part 6, then black was doing well, correct? And so in this setting, white is in a little bit of a bind because black is getting pressure on the e4 pawn before white has developed a threat of f5 or developed a threat of e5 or let alone gotten castled long and maybe even done a queen f3 type of attack. So those sort of things are things you note, and this is why Kasparov's position becomes so easy to play, and it's really an ideal example of why you don't want to play this particular structure and castle short. A little foreshadowing for what I'm going to say in the end of the video, and for why you need to be more aggressive against the Scheveningen structure. Again, would be a good example. Yes, you could take here. Funny, I wonder if I could even ignore it and just take back this pawn maybe, but no, I would take it, and after you take, I would put my queen on a natural square, and after you take, maybe I would just take back, and here you've gained a rook and 2 pawns for the 2 pieces if you're keeping score at home, kiddies. But it's a typical middle game where the 2 pieces are that particular piece conglomerate is better than the rook, because what do the rooks need? They need the open files, they need pawn targets on the open files, they need control over the 7th rank or pass pawn races where the rooks can show their, they sort of flex their muscles over the minor pieces. And when you're in what's going to be now a maneuvering middle game, we love the pieces here. We love the bishops, we love the knights. It almost feels like black just has so many more pieces than white because the rooks are not going to be a serious factor. Now, a good player maybe could outplay a weaker player here as white, but 2 good players playing, we would give black the edge. And again, we're going to give an example of that from one of my own personal library, one of my own personal games in the next video. But so that's why this isn't played here, and so of course f3 is played instead just to defend the pawn, and now we've officially reached a position where I consider this like a stem position of the knight. Or if you're getting these types of comfortable positions and your opponent has like essentially a Yugoslav attacking structure which is designed to castle long and play over here, again, I'm going to mention that in the end, but he's castled short. So he has an attacking structure that supports e4 and supports pawn storms, but he's not in a position to do a pawn storm with the king castled so quickly. Whereas black is just a matter of time of him completing the queenside development and sort of dictating play for the rest of the game. And that's basically what Kasparov does. I mean, he develops the knight to c6 here, choosing a Scheveningen approach rather than a Najdorf approach of knight here and here. It's possible he didn't want to put the knight here because maybe now with the extra tempo here, white might be able to take. Again, I would still personally take black in a lot of these positions, but maybe now with the extra tempo of the pawn being guarded and white immediately being able to play a move like knight to d5, trading off another set of minor pieces and maybe going to mobilize the pawn majority. It's possible he didn't want that. I've played those positions and still preferred the pieces because I have a little bit of a bias there. I prefer the minors there. Or it's possible he just saw that, with the move knight to c6, he looked at the position as one where he doesn't mind trading off a minor piece here because white is not in a position to get a kingside attack, so that's not an issue. And with the e4 pawn being overprotected, bringing the knight to c5 isn't as important as it is, for example, in the last video, like the Hoya Fawn game, where the knight on c5 was exerting critical pressure. Why? Because white had already extended the pawn to f4. So again, realize with the knight on c5, when this pawn's extended, that's a different situation because the pressure there makes a better approach for black in the middle game. Here, black doesn't really care about that. So he played knight to c6, and white traded and played queen to d2. Knight to d7, a very common and good relocation, not only opens up ideas of putting the knight on e5 or c5, but also frees the square for the bishop potentially if tactics need be. The other thing is that the only potential weakness in the Scheveningen structure for black, in terms of just a pure middle game sense, as many of you know, is what? You can pause the clock to remember. Ding, 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 the D pawn, right? So if white was just to play rook to D1 and maybe even bishop F4, you might have some issues defending the pawn. And if you have to play E5, well, we know what happens whenever we extend that E pawn. These squares become weak. So white is sort of preparing a very straightforward, not a very deep threat, very sort of surface level. It's easy to see what white's next couple of moves might be. And so knight D7 is a good move that prepares one way to meet that. If rook f to d1 is played, which is what happened, queen to c7, if this move is played, you think that black is going to play e5 or another move? You can pause the clock and think about it. But if bishop f4 is played, he's going to play this move. This is a very common idea in these kind of Sicilians where the knight is really untakeable. Giving up the bishop pair and actually in the process increasing your opponent's control over the critical center squares is probably the last thing white wants to do. You've opened up this bishop, beautiful dark square control by black. The d file will soon belong to black. And again, the control over these critical squares is just too much. And it's something that you see in like Smith-Morra gambits, where sometimes you just put a knight on e5 and to eliminate the pressure here, and you really have no fear of the double pawns. It actually sort of removes this weakness from the d file, right? So be aware of this idea of knight d7. This is a really common piece maneuver in this structure. And again, we're learning piece coordinations, piece maneuverings, the formations of how the pieces want to set up, along with just sort of the general ideas of every structure we cover. So white played the move queen f2 instead of bishop f4, and I'm going to ask you guys why black doesn't immediately set up the very common battery of the queen and bishop. It's a very strong one. The bishop and queen do very well here, and they sort of coordinate perfectly to advance these pawns on the queen side. This is a very common setup in a Scheveningen structure, whether you reach it via the Scheveningen or the Najdorf. But why is it that black doesn't play that move right away? Okay, assuming you pause your clock to think about it, the move queen to b7 is strongly met by the move knight d5. We see another counter tactical shot, a very common one again to be aware of. Very strong move that attacks the bishop on e7, and of course defending it I would just chop Alicius and, you know, bam, take care of the little guy on d6. And bishop d8 is not a fun move to play either. I wonder if maybe white has to back up the knight and just create pressure, but probably not, because the knight still isn't capturable. So maybe something like queen to g3 and just increasing threats is good enough for for white. And of course I can't take it, because you take it and my bishop is trapped, and now instead of black getting the bishop pair in a better structure via a trick, we're going to see white get the bishop pair in a better structure because of a trick. So that's the last thing we want. We don't want to forget moves like that. Games are lost even after a good solid opening, you know, where you know your opponent hasn't really played that great with a structure that's not very dangerous for white, and then you miss a tactical shot like that. So, of course, Kasparov doesn't do that. He plays the move rook f d8 because he's a stud, freeing up this square for the bishop and sort of eliminating these tactical ideas. And after the move knight to e2, now here he chooses not to play queen to b7 because of threat knight to d4. He's playing a fellow grandmaster, Serapus, so this is a good game. I mean, these are two strong players, younger years of Kasparov, and you know, so one move is met by another. You know, he creates the trick of knight d5. Kasparov doesn't miss it. He frees up the position, and so white creates another threat, which is to just come win the bishop pair, which will queen b7 would be met by knight e5. So, knight d4. So black plays knight e5 and meets knight d4 with bishop d7. The ideal version of the queen and bishop battery with the pawn storm was not reached, but again, one thing you'll notice about all these moves is white has sort of employed tactical tricks with the knight and sort of maneuvering things to prevent black from getting his ideal setup. But is white doing anything to improve his position? Ask yourselves that. Right? The answer is no. And so black is preparing to bring pieces into good squares and still just sort of slowly outplaying white, and loves the fact that the play is all on the queen side, because that means his king is over here just sitting pretty, right? Literally taking a nap, not worry about anything. So after c3, black goes ahead and puts the knight on c4. White refuses to give up the bishop pair immediately, either by taking or letting him take. But Kasparov plays bishop f8, which is a strong maneuvering move, and it's kind of the beginning of him employing an idea that he eventually sort of became famous for in his career, which was, I'll make a couple moves and show you. After move h3, white doesn't really know what he's doing. Queen to b7, bishop to c2, again, rook a to c8. We see that all black's pieces are really putting themselves on safe, protected squares. White's pieces are maneuvering and they look kind of cute, but are they doing anything? Again, no, right? You can feel all warm and cozy inside, you know, until the bear knocks down the door and you're getting eaten, right? I don't know where that reference just came from, completely out of the blue. But my point is, you can maneuver your pieces and they sort of look good and like, oh, right, I like potential on the king's side, yeah? Well, you've got nothing, because black is just going to eventually start preparing space and gaining space and preparing threats on the queen side, and really the structure has not been set up for white to really get anything going. And again, so here in this position, after the move king h1, showing again that white doesn't quite have any way to improve his position without making it worse, Kasparov plays the idea that, as I said, is one of the ideas he became famous for, which is g6, sort of combining the dragon and the Najdorf. Kasparov was in the mid-90s, was someone who employed the dragon a lot, even though the dragon has one of those crazy double-edged reputations, right? People that love the dragon essentially are, you know, like addicts who have a hard time admitting they have a problem. And believe me, I'm a former dragon addict, so I can stand up here before you and say, "Hi, my name's Danny. I'm a dragon addict, and I'm here to begin my 12-step program to start playing more consistently decent positions." I'm kidding. I really just made that up. But seriously, the thing about the dragon is against a well-prepared Yugoslav attack and against a well-prepared player is it really is sort of poisonous, and you get some really incredible wins, and it's a lot of fun to play and can be effective as a surprise weapon. But as your main weapon, it's at a high level. We're talking as you near 2200 plus, it's really just something you have to stop playing. And so lower than that, I mean, I wouldn't say that's necessarily true, but even I would say maybe even lower than that these days with so many people being more well-prepared, even 1900, 2000 players being so much more well-prepared. So that's my theory on the Dragon. But before the Dragon was known as sort of a slightly dubious choice from Black, at least on a consistent basis. Kasparov employed it a lot in the 90s, and he was famous for also playing Najdorf positions and then eventually relocating this bishop and playing g6 and sort of creating a dragon bishop along the diagonal, and also having a Scheveningen structure. And there's a lot of advantages to that. The bishop does so well on this diagonal, and the Scheveningen structure controls a lot of the critical squares. And in the process of playing in Najdorf, your opponent, of course, has not played a Yugoslav attack, which means that they're not checkmating you. And so if you sort of take your time to relocate and create this dragon bishop sort of, we'll say artificially, kind of fianchettoing it by hand, right? Then you have a potentially great bishop in a Sicilian. There's a reason why the Dragon has its reasons, because the bishop on that diagonal is very dangerous in a Sicilian, right? Every good opening that was good for a while at least has a purpose. So I'm not saying the Dragon has no purpose, and in fact, it's incredibly dangerous for white if they don't know what they're doing. But again, I would say that against high-level competition, it's not the best. So anyway, beyond that Dragadorf sort of tangent, the Dragadorf that Kasparov invented, turning a Najdorf into a dragon with this remaneuvering of the bishop, I would say that this position is just becoming better and better for Black. And after the move knight b3, he put the bishop on g7. White is sort of realizing that he needs to dislodge this knight here in order to create threats against the d-pawn, or he really has no chance, his piece is being completely blocked. And after the move d5, booyah, in your face, exclamaviach, all of a sudden we see Black's pieces in space all coming to life. And I love when pieces all sort of make funny shapes, right? Like sort of a pyramid triangle with the knight at the spearhead, right? How sexy is that? I just made that up with my arrows. As you guys know, I love drawing arrows. So after knight takes c4, took here, and created the backward b2 pawn, White is still defending, and again, though getting outplayed as White, it's hard to just beat somebody even if they make mistakes. And so Kasparov, spent the next few moves maneuvering his pieces. He simplifies by trading off a pair of rooks. White recognizes that trading off another piece is probably a bad idea, because if Black is sort of dictating play between this open file to this open file with the weaknesses on the dark square pawns, and notice how this pawn sort of cripples these backward pawns all by himself, right? That would not be in White's best interest, so he decided to keep the pieces on the board. And after bishop came back to d5, Black relocates to get pressure on the b file. Slowly but surely, h5, just sort of expanding, kind of taking his time. Notice that White doesn't have a lot of play. White has to be careful about potential tactics here. And after rook d7, relocating the rook to b7, a little bit of a rook lift. We see kind of a picturesque situation where White is sort of crippled to defending his weaknesses. Queen to d2, bishop e5, bishop d1. Gave a little check on Lina Lachlamba, because why not? And after bishop d6, we're threatening the move bishop takes a3, and White chose not to defend the pawn and subsequently lost. Tried to trade this pawn for this pawn, which is not a bad idea when you're in a worse position, to try to create like a practical trade. Your opponent maybe makes some mistakes and takes a piece that you were probably going to lose anyway and lets you get active, right? But in this case, he underestimated Kasparov's play. The best move was the move a4 here to save the pawn. But after bishop f4, I just gave a quick line. Again, bishop e3, not possible, because we'll just make a trade and pick up the pawn. And, expanding over here, I think that Black can relocate the pieces and continue to make progress, maybe exposing the potentially weak king while keeping an eye over here. This is not a fun position for White to play. Okay, we'll just say that. So he played bishop d4 and went ahead and gave up this pawn, hoping to get the a6 pawn. But and noted should be that taking here would allow these tactics on dark squares. So White is not a total dummy here. He knows what he's doing, and taking with the rook with tempo would also allow something similar potentially. Maybe the queen relocates somewhere and creates issues on the king side. So bishop d6 was the nice move, but after rook takes a6, bishop f4, White realizes that he's going to lose the b pawn too, and just never gets access with the queen. Never gets that practical counterplay he needed. And the game is quickly over. He decides he has to trade off that bishop, and after he loses the b-pawn, he simply threw in the towel. There's threats over here along the b-file, as well as access along these dark squares, and not to mention the fact that the material count also favors also favors black. So that was a really instructive game to see why white can't afford to play this sort of slow approach in a Scheveningen structure, whether it's a Najdorf or a Scheveningen, at least not with the idea of castling short and playing f3. It's just a positional mistake, and it can be turned into a disaster when black's queenside play dominates a game. Those are some of the types of games why I personally started playing the Sicilian, because those positions were so easy and comfortable and a lot of fun for black to play. And a lot of players just don't understand that you don't just want to get castled and play f3 and have no real play on the king side as black just continues to do what he does and play on the queen side, and white has problems. So as I foreshadowed, what you need to understand is that there are many ways for that particular structure to be effective. And one thing that we're going to get into in the Pawn Structure 101 video series, and I'm sure I'll get some comments here of people just super excited for when that day finally comes, especially the Don't Fear the Sicilian group that I created in view of the Chess University lecture I did about a year and a half ago. We covered a lot of this stuff in terms of how to play against the Sicilian. But the structure, of course, I'm talking about is an English attack structure, which is a universal structure that essentially looks like this. Here, just to make a few moves, we'll see that white goes ahead and plays the same structure you just saw in the last game. But what's the major difference? When we put the queen on the king side, when we put the king on the queen side, we have the ability to expand these pawns very rapidly. And f3 supports g4, which in turn supports h5, which in turn opens up play for the rook and creates all kinds of lines of attack for your white pieces on the king side. So don't get the idea that this structure is completely ineffective. But combining this structure with castling short, without really saying it in a politically correct way, I'll say is essentially an amateur move, to be totally honest with you. Playing a structure like this and castling short without some specific exceptions is really generally an amateur idea that only expert players or below would do, not really understanding the ill-effectiveness of that sort of structure. It's not the way white wants to play these days on a modern level with modern knowledge of the Sicilian. So now the English attack is very sharp, and when black plays the Najdorf, don't even kid yourself. You're about to see some of the sharpest positions you ever see in like open chess, and we see all kinds of craziness. This just being one example of a line. But I wanted to highlight that this structure will be covered in this series, and it's a different type of approach. And again, it highlights immediate pressure with pawn storms and castling long, not castling short as Kasparov's opponent did in this game, rendering basically his kingside play ill-effective. Well, that was pretty much a wild ride. I don't know if you guys enjoyed it. You probably had no time to even grab a refreshment because you literally sat down and pressed play and were just like mesmerized and taken on like a magic carpet experience. And all of a sudden, you've literally just LOL'd in your own pants, and you're just so excited that you just watched this video that you're freaking out because you just learned a lot about the Sicilian. Guess what? You're welcome, chess.com. We'll see you around.